Cargo theft losses surged to nearly $725 million last year, a 60% increase from 2024, according to CargoNet. But help might be on the way in the form of the Combating Organized Retail Crime Act, which is seeing some movement on Capitol Hill. I talked to Scott Cornell, who was part of getting cargo theft provisions added to that bill, to get more insights. I'm Deborah Lockridge, and this is an HTT Talks Trucking Short Take. Scott Cornell is Vice President at LogistIQ Insurance and Chair of the Transported Asset Protection Association, or TAPA Americas. That's a nonprofit that develops cargo theft prevention standards and works closely with law enforcement and the industry. And he's spent decades investigating cargo theft.
A couple of years ago, the CORCA bill came up, and it was at the time just about retail crime, organized retail crime. And it was brought to my attention by some law enforcement personnel that had read it and seen it, and they said, hey, this would actually work pretty well for cargo theft. So I read through it, agreed, worked with some people from our government affairs division back then, wrote up the wording, went to their Grassley's office. We've been to Washington multiple times to talk about it, answer questions about it, and it was recently marked up and moved to the floor, so it looks like there's good hope that it will get passed. And what it does is it establishes mandatory tracking of cargo theft in the United States, which is needed. There's no the federal government does not track cargo theft accurately right now in the United States. And then it also establishes a federal task force, which the current wording says that the task force would sit within Homeland Security. And I think there's been some changes or alterations that would also have FBI participation and other federal branches of law enforcement, which would be great for the industry to have that kind of a federal resource. And then also it would establish, I believe, designate some federal prosecutors to the issue, which would be great.
So this bill, one of the things that it would establish is federal tracking. Why is that a problem, and why hasn't it been done in the past?
Cargo theft really is, when you think about it, it really is a morphing of several different crimes. A police officer, a member of law enforcement in Iowa could see it as an auto theft because there's a vehicle involved, right? And a police officer in Texas could see it as a property crime because you're stealing a load of televisions, right? And they could use several different crimes or criminal codes to report that crime or take a report on that crime. Now, there are some states like Georgia, Florida, California, and some other states that have state statutes around cargo theft. But federally, it just hasn't been tracked. Now, CargoNet, which is an organization that tracks cargo theft for the industry, really does a fantastic job. The only issue is that it's voluntarily reported to them. They do a great job of getting that data out to the industry, and most of the experts like myself rely heavily on that data.
I'm curious, when you went to talk to our elected officials and told them about this, were they surprised? What did they think about this issue of cargo theft?
Most of the time we got full support. In fact, I can't think of an incident where we didn't. I was told that during the markup period it was pretty much bipartisan support. So I think there's an acknowledgement that by everybody who hears about it, that there's an issue and there needs to be resources around it.
So you mentioned the changes we've seen in cargo theft over the past few years. So talk a little bit about that.
Cargo theft in the United States fundamentally changed between 2020 and 2022. Prior to 2020, it was really conducted by these small, pretty unsophisticated regional crews, and they did primarily straight theft, right? Straight theft is when you go straight out to the freight and you steal it physically. You're physically on location stealing it. 2020 to 2022, cargo theft in the United States went international, and most of the cargo theft being conducted in the United States, or a good portion of cargo theft being conducted in the United States right now, is driven by these very large, sophisticated, organized crime rings that are operating from dozens of different countries, right? And their preferred method is strategic theft, which is the use of deception. Always starts with the use of deception to trick a member of the supply chain into giving them the freight unknowingly but willingly. And a lot of the freight that's stolen now is being moved overseas. Between 2022 and 2024, cargo theft in general, according to CargoNet, went up 93%, but strategic theft went up 1,475%.
What are some things this bill would do to address that, and how would that impact motor carriers and brokers and shippers?
Well, I think the biggest thing is it would give us that federal task force resource, right? I always want to be careful with this. I think sometimes there's a perception that, we get this task force and it will fix everything.
No.
And it won't, right? It's just going to give us a dedicated tool, dedicated resource to combat cargo theft with. Quite often when they create a federal task force like this, that federal task force, can provide funding to states so that they can have a task force with a federal liaison in it. So it certainly should bring more resources to the effort to combat cargo theft. It will give us, dedicated law enforcement. And I think one of the biggest things that we want to see out of this is the prosecution, right? So if there are dedicated federal prosecutors that are going to try these cases and they get really familiar with these cases and they figure out, the best way to go about prosecuting them, I think that'll go a long way. It's not going to solve the problem, but it should help for sure.
We'll be keeping an eye on the CORCA bill as it moves through the legislative process. Watch for my full interview with Scott, where he talks about cargo theft trends and what trucking fleets can do to protect themselves.